Before we begin, a word of advice. If you ever feel the need to test the people you love, you probably already know the answer. The test is just for the record. It's the period at the end of a sentence you wrote in your heart years ago. I'm Gene. I'm 67 years old, and this is the story of how I wrote my final chapter. I hope you'll stick with me for this one. It's a story about money, but it's not really about the money at all. It's about the deafening silence where you expect to hear a heartbeat. The chair I'm sitting in is old. The leather is cracked like a riverbed in a long drought, and it groans every time I shift my weight. It was the first piece of furniture I bought for myself after the sale. Not with the money from the sale, of course. I bought it from a second-hand shop for $40. It fit the part. For the last 10 years I've been playing a part. The role of Gene, the retired project manager, the guy who did okay for himself, saved a little, and was now enjoying a quiet, simple life in a quiet, simple house. It's a comfortable role, an anonymous role. The real me, the one who built a data compression company from a garage startup into a multi-billion-dollar acquisition target. I put him in a box a long time ago. I signed an NDA so thick it could stop a bullet, and I walked away. I wanted peace. I wanted to see if my children, raised without the poison of extravagant wealth, could become good people. Not successful people, not powerful people. Just good. My lawyer, Arthur, is coming on Friday. His shoes will be polished to a mirror shine, his suit will be impeccably tailored, and he will carry a leather briefcase that costs more than my car. He will not park his German sedan in my driveway. He'll park it down the street out of respect for the character I've been playing. Arthur is the only other person on earth who knows the whole story. He's the keeper of the vault, the executor of my will, and the only friend who's seen both sides of my life. And on Friday, we are going to change my will. Drastically. Because my little experiment, my desperate last-ditch effort to find a vein of gold in the rock of my own bloodline, has been illuminating. Last Tuesday, I picked up the phone. My heart was thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't an easy lie for me. I've spent my life building things on logic and truth. Deception feels like swallowing sand, but I had to know. I called my son Marcus first. He's 40, a vice president of marketing at some soulless firm that sells. I'm not even sure what they sell. Image, I suppose. He answered on the third ring, his voice clipped and impatient as always. Hey Dad, what's up? I'm in the middle of something. I took a deep breath and let my voice tremble, just a little. I'd practiced it in the mirror. Marcus, son, something's happened, something terrible. The silence on the other end was telling. It wasn't the warm, concerned silence of a loving son. It was the cold, calculating silence of a man weighing a new variable. What is it, Dad? Is it your health? The word health was laced with a hint of inconvenience, of future appointments, and tedious hospital visits. No, son, it's the pension. My old company pension. I got a letter. It seems the fund was mismanaged. Criminally mismanaged, they're saying. It's gone, Marcus. All of it. It's all gone. The lie was crafted with what I thought was a certain elegance, plausible, tragic, and hitting the one nerve that truly mattered, money. For a man like Marcus, the loss of money is the only real tragedy. There was a sharp intake of breath on his end. Gone. What do you mean, gone? How much was in it? That was the first question. Not are you okay? Not what can I do? But how much? I told him the number I'd invented. A respectable sum for a retired project manager, but a pittance in the grand scheme of my actual life, enough to represent the total collapse of my financial security. I'm broke, son. The house is paid for, thank God, but for everything else, I don't know what I'm going to do. His response was a string of hollow platitudes. Oh Dad, that's awful, that's just terrible. But I could hear the gears turning behind the words. I could hear the mental abacus, clicking and clacking, calculating not my loss, but his potential liability. Don't do anything rash, he said. We'll talk. I have to run. And he was gone. Next I called Chloe, my daughter, 36, married to a man named Derek, who has the spine of a sea cucumber, and mother to my 2 grandchildren. Chloe has always been the softer one, the one I thought had a deeper well of empathy. Her reaction was, on the surface, better. She gasped. She said, "Oh, Daddy, no, that's not possible." Her voice was thick with what sounded like genuine shock, but as the conversation went on, the texture of her concern began to change. I repeated the story. The mismanaged pension, the sudden poverty. Derek was in the background. I could hear him murmuring, "What is it? What's wrong?" Chloe relayed the information in a hushed, frantic tone. Then she came back on the line. "Daddy, are you sure? Maybe it's a mistake. You need to call them back. You need to get a lawyer." Her panic wasn't for me. I realized. It was for the disruption. Her life, her comfortable, predictable life, had just been rocked by an unforeseen complication. Me. I was the complication. "We'll come over," she said. "We'll come over this weekend. Don't you worry, we'll figure something out." I hung up the phone, and sat in this very chair. The silence in the house was immense. For 10 years, I had curated this quiet. I had chosen it, but this was a new kind of silence. It was the sound of a foundation cracking. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality beginning to dissolve. The results of my little experiment were already coming in, and they were, as I said, illuminating. My children didn't see a father in crisis. They saw a problem to be managed. A line item on their budget that had suddenly, inconveniently, gone into the red. And the week that followed that phone call taught me more about my own children than the preceding 40 years combined. The first 24 hours were a void. Not a single call back. Not a text message asking if I was okay. I imagined their house, Marcus's sleek, minimalist condo overlooking the city, was a flurry of frantic phone calls. Not to me, but to his financial advisor, to his wife, figuring out the blast radius of my little financial implosion. I imagined Chloe and Derek at their kitchen table, the casserole they promised to bring me, still just a concept, talking in worried whispers about what helping Dad would actually entail. Would they have to chip in for my property taxes? Would their planned trip to Tuscany have to be postponed? These are the things I imagined, and the accuracy of my imagination was, I would soon learn, depressingly sharp. It was Marcus who broke the silence, not with a call, but with a text message the next afternoon. "Hope you're holding up. I've cleared my schedule to come by tomorrow at 2. We need to get a handle on this, like I was a leaky pipe or a pest infestation, not a father who was, for all he knew, facing the terrifying prospect of poverty in his old age. There was no warmth, no love, just the cold efficiency of a manager dealing with a logistical hiccup. The dread I felt waiting for him was a physical thing. It sat in my stomach like a stone. I've faced down hostile boardrooms, negotiated with corporate sharks who would sell their own mothers for an extra percentage point. I've never felt fear like that. This was different. This was a fear of confirmation. The fear that the little, nagging suspicion I'd held for years was about to be proven true in the most brutal way possible. I thought back to a time, maybe 5 years ago. Marcus had gotten himself into a jam with a can't-miss real estate venture, a pre-construction condo in a trendy part of town. He'd over-leveraged himself, convinced it would double in value before he even had to make the first mortgage payment. It didn't. The market cooled, the developer ran into problems, and Marcus was on the hook for a deposit he couldn't afford to lose. He came to me, cap in hand. Not apologetic, not embarrassed. He was annoyed that the world hadn't bent to his will. "Dad, I need $100,000. He said it just like that, sitting on the edge of my sofa, refusing to make eye contact, scrolling through his phone, as if the conversation was an irritating distraction. $100,000, I asked, keeping my voice even. "What for?" He waved his hand, dismissively. It's just a bridge loan. A liquidity issue. You know how it is. I didn't know how it was. I'd built my company on careful planning and risk aversion. I'd never had a liquidity issue in my life. But I looked at my son, at his expensive suit, and his watch that cost more than my entire wardrobe, and I saw a stranger. I gave him the money. I transferred it from one of my smaller non-trust accounts, the one I used for my pension. It was a drop in the ocean for me, but it should have been a lifeline for him. He took it without a word of thanks. A month later, at a family dinner, I heard him telling Derek how he'd masterfully navigated a tricky market correction. He'd absorbed my help and rewritten the narrative to make himself the hero. He never mentioned the $100,000 again. It wasn't a loan. It wasn't a gift. In his mind, it was simply his due. That memory was playing in a loop in my head when his pearl-white SUV pulled into my driveway. He stepped out, dressed not for comforting his grieving father, but for a business meeting. He had a slim leather portfolio under his arm. He walked into my house, and his eyes did a quick dismissive scan of my living room. The old chair, the faded rug, the bookshelf filled with paperbacks instead of first editions. It was the same look of faint disgust he always wore when he came here. He didn't hug me. He didn't even put a hand on my shoulder. He sat on the sofa, opened his portfolio, and took out a legal pad. "All right," he said, his voice all business. "Let's triage this. First, the house. It's paid off, you said." I nodded, mute. "Good. That's our biggest asset. What's the property tax bill? Do you have the latest assessment?" He was talking about my home, the home I'd lived in for 30 years, the home where I'd raised him and his sister. He was talking about it like it was a number on a balance sheet. "Our biggest asset. Not your home, Dad. Our asset." The questions kept coming, a rapid-fire interrogation. "What about your car? Can we sell it? You don't need a car that big anymore. Do you have any savings at all? Any stocks, bonds?" He wanted a full accounting, a complete stripping down of my life, into a series of numbers he could plug into a spreadsheet. I answered in monosyllables, feeling myself shrink with every question. The man I was pretending to be, the broken, penniless old man, was becoming real. The despair he would be feeling was seeping into my own bones. There wasn't a single question about me, not one. He didn't ask if I was scared. He didn't ask if I was sleeping. He didn't ask how it felt to have a lifetime of security ripped out from under me. His only concern was damage control, how to contain the problem of his suddenly destitute father, with minimal impact on his own pristine life. After an hour of this, he snapped his portfolio shut. "Okay," he said, standing up. "This is bad, but it's manageable. I've got a call into my financial guy. He'll have some ideas. The main thing is, you can't stay here. The carrying costs are too high. We'll have to sell the house." And there it was, the solution. Sell my life, liquidate my past, so he wouldn't have to be inconvenienced. "Don't worry, Dad," he said, patting my shoulder with an awkward, unfamiliar gesture. "We'll get you into a nice little place, something affordable." He was already moving me into a box. I just stood there as he walked out the door, the stone in my stomach now a lump of ice. Chloe's visit was the next day. She and Derek arrived bearing the promised casserole, a peace offering that smelled of cream of mushroom soup and regret. Chloe's face was a mask of strained sympathy. She hugged me, a quick fluttery embrace that felt more like a collision with a nervous burp. Derek just hovered by the door, wringing his hands, looking at the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but at me. Where Marcus was a shark, all teeth and cold calculation, Chloe and Derek were jellyfish. They drifted, they stung with passive, well-meaning incompetence. They sat down and Chloe began, "Daddy, we are so sorry. This is just awful. We were up all night worrying about you." Derek nodded vigorously, like a bobblehead doll. "All night," he echoed. "Terrible." I remembered a time when Chloe was younger, maybe 15. She'd found a baby bird that had fallen from its nest.
She'd been so tender with it, crafting a little bed out of a shoebox and cotton balls, trying to feed it with an eyedropper. Her heart had ached for this tiny helpless creature. She had spent 2 days nursing it, crying when it eventually died. Where was that girl? Where was the person who could feel another's pain so acutely? I looked at her now, at her carefully neutral expression, and I couldn't find a trace of her. Their solution was, in its own way, even more cruel than Marcus's. It was couched in the language of love and concern. "Dad, we've been talking," Chloe said, glancing at Derek for support. "And we think, well, at your age, maybe this is a blessing in disguise." "A what?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "A blessing. You know, this big house, it's a lot to keep up with. The yard work, the cleaning. Maybe it's time to think about downsizing." Derek chimed in, finding his voice. "There are some really wonderful retirement communities nearby. Top notch. They have activities, bingo, socials. It would be good for you to be around people your own age." They were talking about putting me away. They were talking about taking me out of my life and putting me into a facility, a holding pen for the elderly, so they wouldn't have to deal with the messy reality of my existence. They had a brochure. They'd actually brought a glossy full-color brochure for a place called Golden Meadows Senior Living. Chloe pushed it across the coffee table toward me. The cover featured a smiling silver-haired couple playing shuffleboard. I just stared at it. The slick paper, the cheerful staged photograph. This was their answer. Not, "Dad, you can come live with us." Not, "We'll help you figure this out. We're a family." It was, "Here's a brochure for a place where you can go and not be our problem anymore." The hurt was so profound it was almost surreal. It felt like I was watching a movie about someone else's life. Then Chloe delivered the final devastating line. "And you know, Daddy, if you sell the house, you'll have a nice little nest egg. It would probably cover the costs at a place like Golden Meadows for years." Her eyes were bright. She thought she'd found the perfect solution, one that solved my problem, and more importantly, insulated her from it completely. They left soon after, leaving the casserole on the counter like a tombstone. I didn't walk them to the door. I just sat in my chair, the brochure for Golden Meadows lying on the table in front of me. I looked at the smiling couple, and I felt a rage building in me that was so cold and so pure it was almost peaceful. The test was over. I had my results. The breaking point, the moment that turned my quiet, profound sadness into a hard, diamond-tipped resolve, came later that night. It was a mistake on their part, a careless, stupid mistake that laid their souls bare. My phone rang around 9 o'clock. It was Chloe. Her name flashed on the screen, and I almost didn't answer. I was tired. I felt hollowed out, but I did. I said hello. For a second, there was nothing. Then I heard her voice, but it wasn't directed at me. It was tinny, and I realized I was on speakerphone. She was talking to Marcus. "Oh my God, he's not picking up," she said, her voice frantic. "What if he's done something stupid?"
Marcus's voice, sharp and annoyed, cut through the line. "Relax, Chloe. He's not going to do anything stupid. He's too passive." The word passive hit me like a physical blow. That's how they saw me. That was the sum total of my character in their eyes. Passive. "Now listen," Marcus continued, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone. "Did you talk to him about the house?" "Yes," Chloe said. "Me and Derek showed him the brochure for Golden Meadows. He didn't seem thrilled." "Of course he's not thrilled. You idiot," Marcus hissed. "You don't lead with the nursing home. You lead with the power of attorney. We need to get control of his finances before he does something foolish like take out a reverse mortgage and drain all the equity." The equity. It was all about the equity in my house. Derek's reedy voice piped in. "Marcus, his name is on the deed. We can't just sell it. That's what the power of attorney is for." "You moron," Marcus snapped. "We get him declared incompetent. We argue that this financial shock has broken him. We take over. We sell the house, put him in the cheapest acceptable place, and we bank the rest. It's the only logical move." There was a pause. I could hear Chloe breathing. "But, is that legal?" she whispered. "It's legal if he signs the papers," Marcus said. "And he will. We just have to handle him correctly. You go in soft. I'll come in hard. We'll get him to sign. He's old. He's scared. He'll do what we tell him to do. He always has. He always has." I didn't hang up. I just slowly lowered the phone from my ear and pressed the off button. I sat there in the dark, the words echoing in the silent room. Incompetent. Passive. Cheapest acceptable place. Bank the rest. They weren't my children anymore. They were predators circling what they believed to be a wounded animal. The ice in my gut began to burn. The sadness was gone, burned away by a white-hot fury. The despair was replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like a weapon. For 10 years I had lived this quiet life, telling myself it was for them, to protect them from the curse of wealth, to give them a chance to build character. I saw now that I hadn't been protecting them. I had been enabling them. My simplicity had been mistaken for weakness, my quietness for passivity, my generosity for an entitlement. They hadn't built character. They had built elaborate facades around a core of pure, unadulterated selfishness. The experiment was a success. I now knew exactly who they were, and I knew exactly what I had to do. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about justice. It was about balancing a scale that had been tipped for far too long. I stood up, the old chair groaning in protest, and walked over to my desk. I picked up the phone again. This time I dialed a number I knew by heart. The screen lit up with a name, Arthur Vance. He answered on the first ring, his voice calm and steady, a lighthouse in my storm. "Arthur, it's Jean. We need to talk. We have a problem." And for the first time in a week I smiled. A cold, thin smile. Because I realized I didn't have a problem at all. I had a solution. Arthur's voice on the other end of the line was like an anchor. "Jean, I was wondering when you'd call. Are you all right?" He was the only person who'd asked me that question all week. The only one who hadn't immediately asked about the money. "I'm fine, Arthur. Better than fine. I'm clear." I told him everything. The phone calls, Marcus's visit, Chloe's brochure, and finally the overheard conversation. I recounted their words, their cold, clinical plans for me, without emotion. I felt strangely detached, like a scientist reporting data from a successful if horrifying experiment. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. I could picture him in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and the faint scent of cedar, his brow furrowed, his jaw tight. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and laced with a cold anger that mirrored my own. "The little vultures," he said. "I'm sorry, Jean. I'm truly sorry. But I can't say I'm surprised. I told you, didn't I? 10 years ago." He was right. He had told me. The memory came flooding back, as sharp and clear as if it were yesterday. We were in his office, a sleek, modern space on the 45th floor of a downtown skyscraper. The papers for the sale of Nexus Solutions were spread across the vast mahogany desk. The final number was so large it seemed unreal, a string of zeros that belonged in astronomy, not finance. I was exhausted, exhilarated, and terrified. My life's work, my obsession for 2 decades, had been converted into a liquid asset. I told Arthur my plan. "I'm going to disappear," I'd said. "I'll take enough to live on, set up a simple pension. The rest we lock it away. We put it in a trust so tight, so ironclad, that no one can touch it. Not even me, without your signature. My kids, they'll never know. I want them to have normal lives. I don't want this money to ruin them." Arthur had leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He was older than me by a decade, and his eyes held the wisdom of a man who had seen every possible permutation of human greed and folly. He'd seen families torn apart by fortunes a fraction of the size of mine. "That's a noble sentiment, Gene," he had said, "but it's a naive one. You're not protecting them from the money. You're hiding the truth. You're creating a fiction. And people who live in a fiction tend to get very angry when the story changes. The money isn't the issue. It's a magnifying glass. It just makes people more of what they already are. Don't be surprised if the character you're hoping to find isn't there when you finally go looking for it." His words had been prophetic. The magnifying glass of my feigned poverty hadn't revealed some hidden flaw. It had simply illuminated the rot that was there all along. "You were right, Arthur," I said, into the phone. "You were right about everything. So, what now?" "The vultures are circling. They think the carcass is weak. They're planning to get power of attorney. They think I'm incompetent." A low chuckle came from Arthur's end. "Incompetent, my friend. You are about to become the most competent man they have ever met. This is good, Gene. This is perfect. Let them think they're winning. Let them draw up their papers. Let them make their move. We'll let them walk right into the trap." And so, the real plan began to form. It wasn't just about changing the will anymore. That was the end game. The game itself had to be played first. The next morning, I drove into the city, not in my sensible 10-year-old sedan, but in a town car. Arthur had sent for me. It felt strange, sliding into the plush leather seats, the city gliding by in silence. It was a ghost of a life I'd left behind. We met not at Arthur's law firm, but at the discreet offices of the wealth management group that handled my trust. The place was the epitome of quiet money. No logos on the door, just a simple brass plaque that read Sparrowhawk Capital Group. The name was my idea. I'd always admired sparrowhawks. They're small, unassuming predators. They sit patiently watching, looking like just another bird on a wire. And then, when the moment is right, they are pure, lethal efficiency. It felt appropriate. Arthur was there, along with a stern-looking woman named Miss Albright, the head of the trust. She had the cold, clear eyes of a mathematician and a handshake like a vice grip. They had the full portfolio spread out on a boardroom table that was longer than my living room. Charts, graphs, projections, the numbers had grown. Compounding interest is the eighth wonder of the world, I thought wryly. I had spent a decade meticulously tracking my grocery bills to the penny, while this fortune had quietly multiplied in the dark, like some exotic species of mushroom. "So," Miss Albright said, getting straight to the point, "Mr. Vance tells me you're having some family issues." I nodded. "You could say that. My children are planning to have me declared incompetent, so they can seize my assets. The asset in question, of course, being my 3-bedroom house and my 2012 sedan." Miss Albright didn't crack a smile. "I see. And you wish to let them." "Exactly," I said. "I want them to believe their plan is working. I want them to expose the full depth of their intentions. Then, and only then, will we correct their assumptions." Arthur took over, laying out the strategy. Step 1. I would call Marcus back. I would sound defeated, scared. I would agree to their plan. I would tell them I was considering a reverse mortgage on the house, a detail designed to send Marcus into a panic and accelerate his timeline. Step 2. I would agree to have a lawyer review their power of attorney documents. But not just any lawyer. I would insist on using my lawyer, Arthur Vance. This would be a test of their arrogance. They would see his high-end firm, and likely dismiss him as an overpaid fool I couldn't afford, further feeding their narrative that I was losing my mind. Step 3. We would schedule a meeting, all of us, in my home. They would bring their papers, and we would bring ours. "It's theatrical, I know," Arthur said, a rare glint of amusement in his eyes. "But in my experience, people like your children only understand theater.
They need a big dramatic reveal. A quiet letter in the mail won't have the same educational impact. The final piece of the plan was the will itself. We spent 3 hours that afternoon with Miss Albright and a team of estate lawyers, restructuring everything. The old will, which had split my modest fictional estate 50/50ths between Marcus and Chloe, was ceremonially shredded. In its place, we built a fortress. The bulk of the estate, 95% of it, would now be funneled into a new charitable entity, the Gene Sterling Foundation. Its mission would be twofold. First, to provide scholarships and grants for underprivileged students in STEM fields, to give other kids the chance I had to build something from nothing. Second, to fund organizations that advocate for and protect the elderly from financial abuse and neglect. That part was Arthur's idea. He called it poetic justice. For Marcus and Chloe, there would be no lump sum, no windfall, no chance to buy a new condo or a vacation home in Tuscany. We created 2 small, separate, and brutally restrictive trusts. Each would pay out a monthly stipend. The amount was carefully calculated. It was enough to cover basic living expenses, rent on a modest apartment, groceries, utilities. It was not enough for a country club membership, a luxury car lease, or a table at the city's finest restaurant. It was a safety net, not a golden parachute, and it came with strings. Any attempt to contest the will, any legal action against the estate or the foundation, would immediately and irrevocably void their trust. The money would be rerouted to the foundation, and they would get nothing, not a single penny. There was one last addition, a personal touch. I thought of my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a kind, gentle woman, a widow living on a meager pension, whose greatest joy was her grandchildren, who lived 1,000 miles away and she could barely afford to visit. On a separate sheet of paper, I had Arthur draft a codicil, a one-time tax-free gift of $250,000, to be delivered to her personally, by Arthur, the day after the new will was executed. It felt right. It felt clean. It was a small act of grace in a sea of deserved consequence. Leaving the Sparrowhawk offices that day, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. The weight of the secret, the burden of the lie, was being transformed into a tool. The fury had cooled and hardened into purpose. I was no longer the passive, broken old man they imagined. I was a sparrowhawk, perched on a wire, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The stage was set. The actors were in place. All I had to do was play my part one last time. The phone felt heavy in my hand when I called Marcus the next morning. I took a few deep breaths, summoning the character I needed to be, the confused, frightened old man. I made my voice sound thin, reedy. "Marcus, it's Dad." His voice was instantly sharp, impatient. "Dad, what is it? Did you think about what I said?" I told him I had. I told him I was scared. I told him I didn't know what to do. Then I dropped the bait Arthur had prepared. "I'm thinking, maybe you're right about the house. It's too much." I called the bank. I asked them about one of those reverse mortgages. The explosion on the other end was instantaneous, and exactly as Arthur had predicted. "A reverse mortgage? Are you out of your mind? No, don't you dare do that. You don't sign anything. You don't talk to anyone. Do you understand me?" The sudden raw panic in his voice was startling. It wasn't concern for my well-being, for the predatory nature of those loans. It was the visceral terror of an investor watching his primary asset being set on fire. "We need to handle this, Dad. Now. I'm drawing up the paperwork for the power of attorney. My lawyer says it's straightforward. We can have it done this week. We'll have a family meeting. Me, you, Chloe. We'll get it all sorted out." His tone was no longer that of a son, but of a hostile corporate raider initiating a takeover. "Okay, Marcus," I said, my voice a meek whisper. "Okay, but I want my own lawyer to look at it, just to be safe." There was a pause. "Who? Some local guy? I can get you someone better, cheaper." "No," I said, my voice firming up just a little, a touch of the old man's pride. I have a fellow. His name is Arthur Vance. He's handled things for me in the past. I could almost hear Marcus rolling his eyes. Fine, whatever. Get your guy. Just be ready. I'm setting up the meeting for Friday, at your house, 2 o'clock. Don't be late. He hung up. I smiled. The fish had not only taken the bait, it had swallowed the hook, the line and the sinker. The call to Chloe came an hour later, as expected. She was the cleanup crew, sent in to smooth over Marcus's abrasive attack. Her voice was syrupy sweet. "Daddy, Marcus called me. He said you were thinking about a reverse mortgage. Oh Daddy, you can't do that. Those things are so dangerous. We're just worried about you. We want what's best for you. Marcus is he's a little stressed. He's organizing a family meeting for Friday, so we can all talk and make a plan together. A loving family plan." The condescension was suffocating. They were treating me like a child, a particularly dim-witted one, who couldn't be trusted not to touch the stove. I played along. "Okay, sweetheart," I said. "If you think it's for the best, Friday at 2, I'll be here." The days leading up to Friday were a strange sort of purgatory. They were quiet, but it was a coiled silence, brimming with tension. The mask of civility had been dropped. Marcus's calls became more frequent, more demanding. He'd done a search on Arthur Vance. "Why are you using a guy from a firm like that, Dad? You can't afford him. They charge $1,000 an hour. He's going to bleed you dry." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He was furious that I was spending my non-existent money on a lawyer, while he was actively plotting to take all of it. He tried to get me to cancel the meeting with Arthur, to use a lawyer he'd found, some cut-rate guy, who probably specialized in slip and fall cases. I refused, sticking to the script. "Arthur knows my history," I'd say. "I trust him." My stubbornness on this one point seemed to infuriate Marcus even more. It was a crack in his control, a variable he couldn't manage. Chloe's approach was different. She would call and talk about the grandchildren. She sent me pictures of them playing in the park. It was a transparent, clumsy attempt at emotional manipulation. "See what you have to lose, Dad. Be a good boy, sign the papers, and you can still be part of this happy family." The true moment of escalation, the sign that their panic was reaching a fever pitch, came on Thursday, the day before the meeting. They showed up unannounced. I was in my garden, pulling weeds, when Marcus's SUV and Derek's minivan pulled up to the curb. They got out and marched toward me, their faces set with grim determination. "What's this?" I asked, feigning surprise. "We need to talk, Dad," Marcus said, not even bothering with a greeting. He had a key in his hand, my spare car key, the one I kept on a hook by the back door. "We think it's best if we hold on to these for a while," he said, dangling it in front of me. "For your safety. You're not thinking clearly. We can't have you driving around in your state."
They were trying to ground me, to literally take away my mobility, my independence. Chloe stood behind him, chewing on her lip, looking miserable but saying nothing. Derek was, as usual, a human-shaped shadow. I looked from the key to my son's hard, determined face. The gall of it was breathtaking. For a second, the mask almost slipped. The cold fury rose in my throat. I wanted to tell him right then and there. I wanted to tell him that the car he was so dismissively taking away was a toy compared to the fleet I could buy with the interest I'd earned that morning. But I held my tongue. I let my shoulders slump. I looked at the ground. "Okay, Marcus," I whispered. "If you think it's best." He pocketed the key with a satisfied smirk. "This is for your own good, Dad. You'll see. Now we'll be back tomorrow at 2 with the paperwork. Be ready." They turned and walked away, leaving me standing in my own garden, a prisoner in my own home. I watched them go, and the last shred of familial sentiment I had for them turned to dust and blew away. It was no longer about justice, Arthur could call it educational impact if he wanted to. For me, in that moment, it finally became about revenge. The hours before the 2 o'clock meeting on Friday felt like the final slow climb of a roller coaster. Click, click, click. The tension building with each tick of the clock on the mantelpiece. I'd spent the morning in quiet preparation. I tidied the house, not for them, but for myself. It felt like I was closing a chapter, and I wanted the stage to be set properly. I made a pot of coffee, the smell filling the small house with a sense of normalcy that was completely at odds with the drama about to unfold. At 1:30, I saw a woman walking up my driveway. It was Mrs. Gable, my neighbor. She was carrying a small plate covered in foil. She had a worried look on her face. "Jean, dear," she said, her voice soft, "I saw your children here yesterday. They seemed very agitated, and I saw them take your car keys. Are you all right?" Her genuine concern was a stark contrast to the manufactured sympathy of my own daughter. It was a simple human kindness that felt more valuable in that moment than all the money in the Sparrowhawk Trust. I invited her in, and for the first time, I told someone other than Arthur a part of the truth. I didn't tell her about the money, but I told her about my children's plans. I told her they thought I was losing my faculties and were trying to take control. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and indignation. "Oh, Jean, that's monstrous. After all you've done for them, I remember when you paid for that fancy degree for your son, and the lavish wedding for your daughter. They have no shame." Her validation, her simple clear-eyed assessment of the situation, was like a balm on a raw wound. It was a reminder that the world was not entirely populated by vultures. There were still good people in it. "Don't you worry," she said, her voice fierce. "You are one of the sharpest men I know. If you need a witness, if you need anything at all, you just knock on my door. I'm right here." She put the plate of cookies on the counter and gave my arm a squeeze. Her touch was warm and firm, a real human connection. "Thank you, Helen," I said, my voice a little thick. "That means more than you know." She left just as my children's cars began to arrive. It was like watching a motorcade for a hostile takeover. Marcus's SUV pulled in first, followed by Chloe and Derek's minivan. They got out and stood on the lawn for a moment, conferring in low, urgent tones, like a legal team preparing for a trial. Marcus was holding a thick manila folder, their final weapon. They came in without knocking, asserting an ownership of the space that they didn't have. Marcus's eyes swept the room, looking for Arthur. "He's not here yet?" he asked, a note of triumph in his voice. Maybe he realized he was out of his league. Chloe and Derek settled onto the sofa, a united front of passive aggression. Chloe was wearing a somber gray dress, as if attending a funeral. My funeral, I supposed. They didn't have to wait long. At precisely 2 o'clock, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. Not Arthur's usual car. This was a car from the firm's fleet, piloted by a driver. It was a deliberate power move, a piece of theater Arthur had insisted upon. Arthur stepped out, looking every inch the corporate titan he was. He wore a dark gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie the color of dried blood. He carried his magnificent leather briefcase. He walked into my living room, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The space seemed to shrink around him. He was an apex predator who had just wandered into a petting zoo. He nodded curtly at my children, his eyes sweeping over them with a look of profound disinterest. "Marcus, Chloe," he said, his voice a low baritone that commanded attention. Then he turned to me and smiled warmly. "Jean, good to see you." Marcus, clearly thrown off by Arthur's presence and polish, puffed out his chest and took charge. "Vance," he said, dropping the Mr. as a deliberate slight. "Glad you could make it. We have some documents for my father to sign. We'd appreciate it if you'd look them over and advise him to cooperate. It's for his own good," He slid the manila folder across the coffee table. The power of attorney forms. Arthur didn't even glance at it. He placed his own briefcase on the table and clicked open the two brass latches. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the tense silence. Instead of taking out a legal pad, he removed a single thick book-like document, bound in dark blue leather. On the cover, embossed in gold leaf, were two words, "The Sparrowhawk Trust." He slid it across the table, stopping it right next to Marcus's flimsy folder. It was like placing a battleship next to a canoe. Marcus stared at it, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What's that?" he asked, his voice losing some of its bluster. "That," Arthur said, his voice dangerously soft, "is the agenda for today's meeting." He leaned back in his chair. "Jean, would you like to begin, or shall I?" It was my turn. I took a deep breath. The performance was over. I looked at my children, not with anger, not with sadness,